And welcome back to Devlog. Here's my cover of the King Dice song from Cuphead.
Mr. King Dice, gonna roll my dice. If you don't have me roll, swoop-a-doop-a-doo.
And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part I worked on level design, and in this part I work on Parallax scrolling systems for background elements. This is an interesting devlog because I designed this feature 2 months ago, and then I just never got around to drawing background elements, so I have a feature that I designed 2 months ago and just never got around to talking about. How does the background scrolling work? Very simply, I just have different planes for each level of background, this being the ground, trees behind the trees, rocks, stalagmites, clouds, other clouds, stalactites, and then a loop of the other vertical elements because the backgrounds have to scroll vertically, but that's not really a system. There's just more background tiles above the ones below the tiles on the bottom. And then each of these background tile systems has a setup of how far they should be from the player. They actually aren't a set distance from the player, they're just 20 units in the background, and then they have a calculated distance, which is how the parallax scrolling effect is made. The parent of all these objects will follow the player on the x-axis, which means that the background tiles are either going to move left or right with the player and give the illusion of actually moving. But the issue with this is if they don't have any scrolling, then these background elements are just going to be moving on the x-axis with the player and looking very odd because it's just a tree that follows the player. Spooky background tree. So what I do is I have each of these tile elements scroll with their material based on the X position of the player. This is very simple. I just do a calculation based on the player's X position and then a float value for each of these background elements based on their distance that they should be to the player. This means that each of these background elements can scroll at a different pace, giving the impression of them being a different distance up from the player and having the parallax scrolling effect. So, for example, the trees may have a scrolling of 30, which means for every 30 units the player is going to walk, these trees are going to scroll 1 cycle. So at position 0, you're seeing the view of the tree. You start moving. At position 15, the background has scrolled 0.5, it's scrolled halfway through its texture, and then at 1, it's scrolled all the way back to the beginning, and this just loops for however the player is moving. Then the background tree behind this could have a further distance because it is behind the tree in front of it, so it could have a distance of 40. Then when the player is 40 units, this one is going to scroll completely. This gives the impression of each background element looking further away from the player. It's a very simple system to set up. The only complexity to this is that sprites cannot be scrolled as easily as materials, which is a real bother for 2D games. Now that I'm thinking about it for more than 5 seconds, I think the easiest way to do this is probably have these sprites as a UI element mayhaps, and then have them as a raw image behind the player, and then this can very easily have tiling set to it. But I also want them to use a 2D lighting setup and the 2D visuals in the level, and it was just a lot easier to have them be 3D planes that are then rendered on a sprite layer and have the sprite material set up so that the sprite lighting can work with them. So all I do is I have all of these background elements arranged in a list of what their distance is, and then also from the element that is in front of all the other elements to the element that is behind all the other elements. Then when these are all set up, I can change their render layer to the background layer, and I can also change their render order based on the order that they are arranged in the setup. So the trees would be render layer 0, the trees behind them would be -1, the trees behind that would be -2, so on and so forth, so there isn't any render issues with the fact that all these sprites and planes are basically overlapping. And that's it for coding. It's a very simple system. I basically just add scrolling based on the player's X position. Now let's talk about actual visual designs, because there are 3 issues with the system that I had when designing it that I want to talk about. The first issue is that I had originally the background scrolling have a Y height, so the background elements will move up and down with the player and then swap at different heights. The issue with this is it was very confusing having the trees move up and down with the player, more so than they actually should move up and down. It made jumping and moving up and down in levels very disorienting because the background would move in unnatural ways. The reason to solve this is that I just made the background elements 50 units away, and since I don't use a non-perspective camera, then the background elements are going to not move at a Y height relative to the player's Y height, because you can see in the angle of the camera slightly more than you would be able to at a fixed camera, but they are still going to move organically and not in a disorienting way. The issue with this is I had to make a background design that would loop vertically, and I didn't want to do that at the time, so I completely removed the system and then tried to manually create background elements. This was also difficult because if you'll see the design of my levels, they're designed in a very convoluted way. For example, they go from a flat ground to other flat ground that are just miraculously above the first flat ground, and I would have to have it so that you're going from a background of trees to sky to other trees very quickly, and you could maybe see the seams of these designs for background elements, and I didn't particularly like it very much. The other option was just drawing a bunch of background elements for each scene, but it's a very large scene and it would take way too much time to do so. So I didn't want to do that. So instead I just designed a setup of backgrounds that could scroll vertically as well as horizontally. This means if I just go up and down, the backgrounds can repeat infinitely. And the issue with this design is that the actual background design visually that I had drawn or conceptualized didn't really work vertically. It didn't really make sense why trees would just infinitely be looping vertically. So my solution for this was just to make the trees on floating islands. And this actually worked surprisingly well. I can have the trees blend into rocky backgrounds, which blends into stalagmites, but those could also be viewed as cliffs, then into clouds, which are very nice and simple for background elements, and then into stalactites, which can be a different floating island with different trees on, and then I can loop the same setup of visuals infinitely for a level. But I've just arranged 3 sets of these because the player isn't going to under-exceed or over-exceed this current setup of visuals for this background element. And this ended up being the easiest option. I just had to draw a few different scrolling backgrounds and then make it designed in a way where these can also be scrolled vertically. It saved a lot of time in level designs, and I didn't really want to spend weeks and weeks designing a visually unique background for each different area or a visually complex background for each area when I can do the simpler option that I think still looks very nice in the levels. I also wanted to keep backgrounds simple, and if backgrounds are really complicated, I felt like maybe the player would be confused as to what is a foreground element and a background element. So if I keep the backgrounds simple and tileable, then I don't really have this issue as much. You can register what background elements are what based on as you're moving around the level. Now let's talk about the actual background visuals. I'm pretty happy with how these all turned out. I tried to do a gradient sort of style for all of these backgrounds, so the backgrounds will blend into each other and be very similar in color schemes. The rocks are a little bit different, but I think they still blend into each other and the other backgrounds pretty succinctly. I basically just drew one giant tree and then had the same tree as a different background element for a further distance background, and then rocks behind that. I tried to keep the designs of these very simple and also keep the visual colors very similar. I didn't want a huge amount of detail on these with a wide array of color blending and different shadows and highlights on all these elements. I really just wanted to give the base impression of these background elements with some level of detail, but not so much that the player can view these as a foreground element or for them to be distracting in the scene. It's basically just a very simple drawing of a tree. Finally, I have further visual designs for the levels. I add sprite lighting to the levels to add more visual diversity to a scene. This is just to make the scene not look like it is lit by a fixed lighting or the fixed sprite lighting for each chunk of the level, but instead a unique setup of lights and rays that may be shining through some of the trees you are seeing. And then I also add a couple of visual particle effects that are going to follow the player around and then create certain trails or visuals as the player is moving. I think this helps make a level look a lot more organic because there's actually things moving in the scene. All I do is add a couple of trails for wind effects. These are just lines that appear in the scene. And then I have a few setup of sprites for the leaf sprites that are just going to fall gently down and be jostled around by the wind that is blowing. This, I think, looks very nice. I'm pretty happy with how the leaves look especially. I think the motion for these, just adding a random velocity amount over time to the particle effect, looks really nice and organic, and I also think it helps some stages to look nicer. In the hard mode, I will replace the leaf sprites with pipe sprites, so pipes just fall from the sky as you're playing. And that's it for Devlog. Next devlog should hopefully be about save load systems and save file systems. Even though the game does not require save files, I am adding save files. If you like this video, like and subscribe, and leave a comment as to which Homestuck character you related to most in high school.